Elijah Carter had never been one to cause trouble. A 38-year-old Navy veteran, he had spent years serving his country, enduring some of the harshest conditions imaginable. He had traveled to places most people had never heard of, stood shoulder to shoulder with his brothers in arms, and put his life on the line in service to his nation. He had faced adversity, danger, and even moments of deep uncertainty, but nothing could have prepared him for the humiliation he was about to endure. It was supposed to be a simple flight. After a well-deserved vacation, Elijah was finally headed home. He had splurged on a first-class seat, a luxury he rarely allowed himself. He had flown coach his entire life, but after years of hard work and sacrifice, he figured he deserved a moment of comfort. It was a reward to himself, a symbol of how far he had come. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt an unusual sense of ease. The cabin smelled of leather and fresh coffee. The seats were plush, and the air was quieter than the chaos of the economy section. Elijah exhaled, allowing himself to finally relax. He greeted the flight attendants politely, placed his small carry-on in the overhead bin, and sank into his seat by the window. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, but that peace didn't last long. A shadow loomed over him, and when he looked up, he found a flight attendant staring at him with narrowed eyes. She was a middle-aged woman, her uniform crisp and her posture rigid. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, as if she were trying to figure out how he had ended up there. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "can I see your boarding pass?" Elijah blinked. He had already shown his ticket at the gate. What was this about? Still, he didn't want to cause any problems. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his pass, and handed it over. The attendant studied it for longer than necessary, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This seat doesn't seem right," she muttered, shaking her head slightly. Elijah frowned. "It's the seat printed on my ticket," he said, keeping his tone polite. "First class, seat 3A. The flight attendant's eyes darted between Elijah and the paper in her hands. A look of suspicion, then something else, something colder, flashed across her face. "One moment," she said before walking away. Elijah felt a flicker of unease. He had been on flights before where people gave him a certain look, a mix of doubt and silent judgment. A black man in first class? Some people just couldn't hide their surprise. But this was different. This was something worse. Minutes passed before the flight attendant returned, this time with a supervisor. The man, older and carrying himself with an air of quiet authority, folded his arms as he looked down at Elijah. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to move," the supervisor said flatly. Elijah's stomach tightened. "Move? Why? My ticket is correct." "There's been a mistake," the supervisor insisted, though he offered no explanation as to what that mistake was. A silence settled over the cabin. Other passengers were beginning to notice. Heads turned, whispers passed between travelers. Some were confused, others indifferent, but a few, the ones who understood what was happening, watched with quiet disapproval. Elijah took a deep breath. "With all due respect, sir, I paid for this seat. I'm not moving unless you give me a legitimate reason." The supervisor's jaw clenched. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then security was called. Elijah felt his heart drop. This was escalating faster than he could comprehend. His grip on the armrest tightened as two uniformed officers entered the plane. "Sir, please step off the aircraft," one of them said, his tone impersonal, professional, like he had done this 100 times before. Elijah stared at them, his chest tightening. Was this really happening? "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "I've done nothing wrong." "You need to come with us, sir," the officer repeated, his patience thinning. Elijah turned to the flight crew, his frustration bubbling over. "You're removing me for what reason? What exactly have I done?" The flight attendant, the supervisor, even the security officers, they all avoided his gaze. None of them had an answer. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few passengers shook their heads, some whispering among themselves. One man, a businessman in a tailored suit, had the nerve to smirk, as if satisfied by the outcome. Elijah realized that no one was going to stand up for him. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stood up slowly. The weight of a lifetime of battles sat heavy on his shoulders, not just the ones fought overseas, but the ones he fought every single day. The silent battles, the moments like these, where dignity was stripped away for no reason other than who he was and where he dared to sit. As he grabbed his carry-on and stepped into the aisle, the humiliation was suffocating. A veteran. A man who had risked his life for his country. A man who had earned the right to be there. Removed like he was nothing. Passengers avoided his gaze as he walked past them. Some turned away in discomfort, unwilling to meet his eyes. A few, though, looked at him with silent understanding. A woman in the second row gave him a nod, small but full of meaning. A younger man shook his head in quiet frustration. But no one spoke, and just like that, Elijah was escorted off the plane. The cold air of the terminal hit him like a slap. He stood there, stunned, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something raw. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about respect. This was about dignity. And at that moment, he knew he couldn't just let it go. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Elijah Carter stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, the weight of the past few minutes pressing down on his chest like an unbearable force. The cool air of the airport did nothing to ease the fire burning inside him. His heart pounded, his pulse roaring in his ears as the humiliation replayed over and over in his mind. Escorted off the plane like a criminal. Dehumanized. Stripped of his dignity. His fists clenched at his sides, his grip tightening around the handle of his carry-on bag. This wasn't just about a seat. This wasn't just about him. Elijah had faced adversity before. He had been through combat, had seen the worst humanity had to offer, had endured situations most people couldn't even fathom. He had fought for this country, put his life on the line for its freedom, for its people. And yet, here he was, a veteran who had served his country with honor, treated like he didn't belong in his own homeland. As he stood there, the reality of what had just happened settled into his bones. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't some clerical error or misunderstanding. He knew that look the flight attendant had given him. He had seen it before. That flicker of doubt in her eyes, the subtle disbelief that a man like him could have a first-class ticket. It was more than just an assumption. It was an unspoken judgment. Elijah's breath shuddered as he exhaled, his mind racing. How many times had this happened to someone else? How many people, good, hard-working people, had been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they were lesser? He had seen it before, in the way people avoided eye contact with veterans on the street, the way people spoke in hushed tones when discussing race and privilege, the way the very institutions meant to serve and protect often failed those who needed them most. And in that moment, Elijah realized something with crystal clarity. This was bigger than him. This was about every veteran who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside the moment they took off their uniform. This was about every black man who had ever been judged before they even opened their mouth. This was about respect, about fairness, about demanding accountability from those who thought they could get away with treating people as if their worth was measured by how they looked, not by who they were. He swallowed hard, blinking against the frustration burning in his chest. The thought of just walking away, of getting a refund and booking another flight, of just letting it go, it felt wrong. If he let this go, it wouldn't just be a personal failure. It would be a silent approval of everything that had just happened. And Elijah Carter was not a man who stayed silent. His grip tightened around his phone as he took a step forward. He needed to act. He didn't know exactly what his next move would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let this go unnoticed. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and opened his social media app. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he started typing, his words coming out faster than his thoughts could fully process. I just got kicked off my flight for absolutely no reason. I had a first-class ticket, I showed my boarding pass, and I was seated properly. But apparently that wasn't enough. Apparently, someone decided I didn't belong there. He hesitated, his jaw tightening before he continued typing. I served my country, I fought for my country, but today I was treated like I didn't matter. This isn't just about me. This is about every veteran who has been disrespected, about every person who has been told they don't belong because of how they look. This is about something bigger. He hit post before he could second-guess himself. Almost immediately, his phone buzzed with notifications. Friends, fellow veterans, and even strangers began to comment, expressing their outrage, their support, their disbelief. But it wasn't just support that fueled Elijah. It was the realization that people weren't just shocked by what happened to him. They were familiar with it. Stories poured in, other veterans who had been ignored, disrespected, and dismissed. Black men who had been questioned about their own belongings, who had been followed in stores, who had been forced to prove themselves over and over again just to be treated with basic dignity. His phone buzzed again, and again, the story was spreading. Then something even more unexpected happened. A well-known journalist retweeted his post, a blue check mark next to their name, a message. This is unacceptable. We need answers. That was all it took. The floodgates opened. Within minutes, Elijah's post had been shared thousands of times. And then, the media picked it up. News outlets began reaching out. People wanted interviews. They wanted to hear his story. Elijah took a shaky breath as he processed what was happening. He had started the day as just another passenger, just another veteran trying to get home. Now he was the voice of something much larger. And he knew deep in his soul that there was no turning back. This was just the beginning. But the question was, would the airline even dare to respond? Would they acknowledge what they had done, or would they try to bury the truth? One thing was certain, Elijah wasn't going to let them ignore it. Not this time, not ever again. Stay tuned, because what happens next will shock you. Elijah Carter is about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. If you believe in justice, in accountability, in standing up for what's right, hit that like button and comment below to show your support. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the moment this airline is forced to answer for what they did. Because this fight, it's only getting started. Elijah Carter sat in the quiet corner of the airport terminal, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. The cold metal of the chair beneath him did nothing to ground him, nor did the indifferent chatter of travelers moving about their own journeys. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers twitching slightly as he replayed the moment he was forced off that plane. The humiliation, the unfairness. It all weighed on him like a crushing force. He looked around, searching the faces of those around him. Did they see what happened? Did they care? Some passengers from his flight were still at the gate, whispering among themselves. Some threw him sympathetic glances, but no one, not one single person, had spoken up for him. His blood simmered, not with rage, but with something heavier, a sense of injustice so profound that it refused to be ignored. His phone buzzed in his hand, but he barely looked at the screen. He knew what he needed to do. He couldn't stay silent. With a deep breath, Elijah unlocked his phone and opened his social media app. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he started typing. I just got kicked off a flight for no reason. I had a valid first-class ticket, I was seated properly, and yet I was told to move. When I refused, because it was in fact my seat, I was escorted off the plane by security. No explanation, no justification. Just a reminder that no matter how much I've given to this country, there are still places some people don't think I belong. His jaw clenched as he continued typing. For those who don't know me, I'm a 38-year-old Navy veteran. I've spent years serving this country, traveling all over the world, fighting for the freedoms we claim to stand for. But today, the only thing I had to fight for was a seat I had already paid for, and I lost. Elijah exhaled sharply, the weight of the words heavy on his chest. He thought about stopping there, but something inside him pushed him forward. This isn't just about me. This is about every veteran who has ever been disrespected, dismissed, and treated as less than. It's about every black man who has ever been questioned, challenged, or forced to prove they belong in a space that should have been theirs in the first place. I won't be silent. This airline needs to answer for what they've done. No veteran should ever be treated like this. No one should. He hovered over the post button for half a second before hitting it. At first, nothing happened. Then within minutes, his phone buzzed. Then again, and again. The likes began to climb. The shares started multiplying. A comment appeared beneath his post. This is unacceptable. No veteran should ever be treated this way. Then another. Unbelievable. I hope you get justice for this. Then something Elijah hadn't expected. A woman's comment caught his eye. My husband was in the military too. He was kicked off a flight 2 years ago for questioning why he was seated in the back when his ticket was for an aisle seat up front. They never gave him an explanation either. He was humiliated, and the airline never apologized. Elijah's stomach turned. This had happened before. His breath caught as he scrolled through more comments. Hundreds of them now. Veterans, black travelers, people of color, all sharing similar experiences. I was pulled off a flight for random questioning and missed my connection. No one else was questioned but me. They told me I needed to pay extra to check my military bag. Even though military bags fly free, I had to show them their own policy. My dad is a veteran. He was once told he couldn't board early with the other servicemen because they didn't believe he was in the military. He was wearing his Navy cap. Elijah swallowed hard. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. His story was one of many, and now the world was seeing it. Then, the moment everything changed, a verified blue check account retweeted his post. This is infuriating. How many times does this have to happen before airlines take accountability? We need answers. Well, and it was from a well-known journalist, someone with hundreds of thousands of followers. The floodgates burst open. Elijah's notifications exploded. Major media outlets began reaching out. News stations were now covering the story. He wasn't just another passenger anymore. He had become a voice for something bigger. Then something else caught his attention. A direct message from a stranger. He opened it. I was on your flight. I saw what happened. I recorded the entire thing. His breath hitched. A video. The person sent the file. With shaking hands, Elijah clicked on play. It was all there, the flight attendant's dismissive expression, the supervisor's refusal to explain himself. The moment security arrived, the way Elijah was treated like a problem rather than a paying passenger. Proof. Elijah's grip tightened on his phone. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was about to show the world the truth. He uploaded the video to his post. The impact was immediate. People who had doubted his story suddenly couldn't deny what they were seeing. News anchors began covering the video. The airline's social media pages were flooded with outrage. Then the final blow, an official statement from the airline. We are aware of the incident regarding Mr. Carter and are conducting an internal review. We take these matters seriously and will be addressing this directly. It was corporate speak, meaningless, designed to quiet the noise. But Elijah wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The world was watching now, and he wasn't about to let them forget. His story had started as a moment of humiliation. Now, it was a movement. What happens next will shock you. If you believe in justice, hit that like button, comment below, and subscribe for updates. Because this fight, it's only just beginning. Elijah Carter sat in his small apartment, his phone vibrating incessantly on the table. The dim light from his laptop screen illuminated his face, highlighting the exhaustion in his eyes. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind. The video of his removal from the flight had exploded online, garnering millions of views. His post had gone viral, and now it was far beyond just social media outrage. His story had become a national conversation. And people were listening. Elijah had been fighting his whole life. Fighting in the military, fighting to make ends meet, fighting against the subtle and not so subtle ways people questioned his worth. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a movement, and it was growing bigger than he ever could have imagined. His phone vibrated again. Another call, another message, another request for an interview. But this time it wasn't just the media, it was lawmakers. It was veterans organizations, it was civil rights groups. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. When he first posted about his experience, he had just wanted one thing. To be heard, but now his story was being used as proof of a larger issue, a symbol of the systemic problems that had existed long before he ever stepped foot on that plane. And the people who had the power to make a change, they were paying attention. His phone buzzed again, and this time he picked it up. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional. Mr. Carter, my name is Senator Elaine Morrison. I've been following your story, and I want to let you know, we hear you. We're not letting this go. Elijah's breath hitched. A U.S. senator, reaching out to him. This is unacceptable, she continued, her voice steady but laced with frustration. What happened to you is a reflection of a much deeper issue, one that goes beyond a single airline. We need to address how veterans and people of color are treated in the airline industry and beyond. I want to help. Elijah swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the phone. What does that mean? He asked cautiously. It means we're calling for an investigation, a formal one. We're bringing this to Congress, and we're using your case as the example. We want you to testify. The words hit Elijah like a brick. Testify, his voice, his story, on record. Before he could respond, the senator continued. You don't have to answer right now, but I wanted you to know you're not alone in this. You have support. We're behind you. Elijah let out a shaky breath. He never thought that something like this would reach Washington. He never thought his fight would be carried to the halls of Congress. But it was happening. Later that day, Elijah received another message, this time from a veterans advocacy group. We stand with you, Elijah. What happened to you is unacceptable, and we're making sure no veteran ever has to go through this again. The message wasn't just words, it was action. The organization had launched a petition demanding that airlines be held accountable for their treatment of veterans. Within hours, it had already reached 250,000 signatures. Then another message, this one from a retired general. Son, you served your country with honor. Now let us serve you. We're behind you 100%. Let us know how we can help. Elijah exhaled sharply. This was bigger than him. What had started as a humiliating experience was now a national reckoning. Veterans from across the country were coming forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. Some had been denied early boarding despite being in uniform. Others had been forced to prove their military status over and over again, as if their service wasn't enough. The voices were getting louder. The pressure on the airline was mounting, and Elijah Carter was right at the center of it all. The airline had remained silent for too long. The backlash wasn't dying down. It was getting stronger. And then, finally, they cracked. A public statement was released. We deeply regret the experience Mr. Carter had on our flight. We are conducting a full internal review and are committed to improving our policies to ensure that every passenger, especially our veterans, is treated with the utmost respect. Elijah stared at the words on the screen. An apology. But was it enough? No, not even close. They were trying to contain the damage, trying to quiet the storm. But the storm was only getting stronger. And now, people wanted action. Elijah knew this fight wasn't just his anymore. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance to change the system. And he wasn't backing down. But he needed your help. This movement wasn't just about one bad experience. It was about justice, about respect, about holding those in power accountable. And now it's in your hands. Like this post if you believe veterans deserve respect. Comment below to show your support for Elijah. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to stay updated because this fight isn't over yet. Elijah Carter's story was more than just a viral moment. It was a movement, and with your voice, your support, and your power, this airline and every other company that thinks they can treat people like this will be forced to change. Because when we stand together, they can't ignore us. Let's make history. Elijah Carter had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the airline would finally acknowledge what they had done. After days of relentless public pressure, viral media coverage, and an outpouring of support from veterans and activists alike, the airline had no choice but to break their silence. A notification popped up on his phone. Official statement for Spiegelman from Eagle Airlines. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he clicked the link. The screen loaded, and there it was, their public apology. Eagle Airlines deeply regrets the unfortunate incident that occurred on Flight 482. We take these matters seriously and are conducting an internal review to ensure that all passengers, especially our veterans, are treated with the utmost respect. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Carter for any distress he may have experienced. As a token of our appreciation for his service, we have offered Mr. Carter a complimentary first-class flight and travel credit. Elijah's grip tightened around his phone. He couldn't believe what he was reading. This wasn't an apology. This was a PR stunt. They were offering him free flights as if that would erase the humiliation, as if that would fix what they did. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. They still didn't get it. They thought this was about him. They thought this would go away with a few travel credits. But this wasn't about one man, one flight, or one airline. This was about justice. This was about respect. This was about every veteran who had ever been dismissed, every black passenger who had ever been unfairly targeted, every person who had been told, without words, that they didn't belong. And they thought a free flight would make it all go away? Elijah wasn't the only one who saw through the airline's hollow statement. Within minutes, the public erupted in outrage. This is your apology? This is insulting. Veterans deserve better than free flights. How about real accountability? I hope Elijah rejects this nonsense. We're not letting this go. Then something even more powerful. Other veterans started speaking out. A retired Marine sergeant commented, "I was denied an early boarding privilege because the gate agent didn't believe I was in the military." The disrespect veterans face is real. This apology means nothing if they don't change their policies. A Navy veteran shared, "They tried to do the same thing to me last year. This isn't a mistake, it's a pattern. We deserve better." The anger wasn't just coming from Elijah anymore. The people had spoken, and they weren't buying the airline's excuses. Later that night, Elijah sat at his kitchen table, staring at the airline's statement one last time before shaking his head. He opened his laptop, took a deep breath, and started typing. "To Eagle Airlines, your apology means nothing. You didn't even say my name in the statement. You didn't acknowledge what really happened. And worst of all, you think offering me a free flight is enough to make this disappear." He paused, his fingers tightening around the keyboard. No, they weren't getting away with this. I don't want your free flights. I don't want your travel credit. What I want is for you to publicly acknowledge what happened and commit to real change. He hit post. Seconds later, his phone exploded with notifications. "Yes, Elijah. Hold them accountable. We stand with you. No more fake apologies. Eagle Airlines, do better." The message was clear. This fight wasn't over. And Elijah, he was just getting started. The backlash was immediate. Every major news outlet was covering it now. The airline's empty apology had only made things worse. By the next morning, Eagle Airlines executives were scrambling. They had underestimated Elijah and the people supporting him. That's when his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Carter, this is Daniel Price, Senior Vice President of Eagle Airlines. I'd like to personally apologize for what happened and discuss how we can make things right." Elijah clenched his jaw. "You mean after your first apology failed?" he said, voice cold. A pause. "I understand why you're frustrated, and I want to assure you that we are taking this very seriously." Elijah exhaled. "So what are you actually going to do?" Another pause. "We'd like to invite you to meet with our leadership team to discuss policy changes." For the first time, Elijah felt them breaking. They weren't in control anymore. He was. He took a deep breath. "If we're going to talk, then we're going to talk about real change. Not PR, not free flights, actual change." The VP hesitated, then sighed. "Understood." Elijah knew this was a step in the right direction. But the fight? Far from over. Like this post if you believe veterans deserve respect. Comment below to tell Elijah to keep fighting. He needs to hear your support. Share this with someone who needs to see it, because the more people who know, the harder it is for them to ignore us. Subscribe to stay updated. This isn't the end. Elijah Carter didn't ask to be in this fight, but now he's ready to see it through. And with you by his side, we will win. Let's make history. Elijah Carter never wanted to be the face of a movement. He never asked to become a symbol of resistance, justice, and change. All he wanted was to sit in the seat he had paid for, to fly home in peace like any other passenger. But fate had other plans. What started as one humiliating moment on an airline had spiraled into something much bigger. A fight for justice, for respect, for every veteran and marginalized traveler who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. The airline had tried to bury the issue with a generic apology and a pitiful offer of free flights. But Elijah, he wasn't letting this go, because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated as if they didn't belong. It was about real change, and Elijah was ready to fight for it. Elijah had spent the last few days studying, planning, and preparing. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a CEO. He was just a man who had been wronged. But he was also a veteran. And if there was one thing the military had taught him, it was that you never back down from a fight worth fighting. So with the help of supporters, Elijah launched a petition. It wasn't just a demand for an apology. It was a call for systemic reform, a demand for airlines to implement real policies that protected passengers from discrimination, that ensured veterans were treated with the respect they deserved. That made sure no one else had to go through what he had endured. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all airline staff, a transparent system for reporting mistreatment with external oversight, veteran-specific policies to guarantee that those who served were given the dignity they had earned. Within hours, the petition had already gained 50,000 signatures. Within a day, it had surpassed 250,000. By the end of the week, over 1 million people had signed. The message was clear. People were tired of being ignored. And now they were demanding action. Elijah wasn't the only veteran who had been mistreated by airlines. Thousands of veterans began sharing their own horror stories. A Marine veteran wrote, "I was in uniform heading home after a deployment, and the airline staff questioned my ticket like I was some kind of imposter. They made me wait while they verified my identity. I've never forgotten the way they looked at me, like I didn't belong in first class." A retired Army officer shared, "My wife and I were flying to my daughter's wedding. She had upgraded my seat as a surprise. When I got to my seat, the flight attendant told me, 'Sir, are you sure this is your seat?' She didn't ask anyone else, just me, a black man in first class." The stories poured in. Too many veterans, too many humiliations, too many moments where their service, their dignity, their humanity had been questioned. And now they were done staying silent. The pressure on the airline was mounting. Their social media was in flames. Every time they posted about promotions or flights, the comments were flooded with, "Respect veterans before selling us cheap flights. Apologize to Elijah Carter. Properly. Where's your commitment to real change?" Then came the news coverage. Major networks began covering the growing movement. Political figures started weighing in, calling for a congressional hearing on discrimination in the airline industry. Elijah watched as his story spread further and further. And then, the moment he had been waiting for. The airline CEO finally spoke out. At a press conference with cameras flashing, he issued a new statement. "We understand that our previous response did not adequately address the concerns of Mr. Carter or the public. We acknowledge the need for real, lasting change. Effective immediately, we will begin working with independent auditors and veteran organizations to develop policies that ensure fairness and respect for all passengers." For the first time, Elijah felt the tides turning. Elijah Carter had never imagined himself as a movement leader. When he was first forced off that plane, humiliated in front of a cabin full of passengers, he just wanted an apology, real accountability. But as days passed, as thousands of veterans and everyday people rallied behind him, as their voices grew louder, and as his inbox filled with stories of others who had suffered similar mistreatment, he realized something crystal clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a broken system, one that had mistreated veterans, people of color, and marginalized groups for years. And it was time to make real change. Elijah had seen protests, online petitions, and news coverage put pressure on corporations before. But he knew that if he really wanted the airline to feel the heat, they needed to see the movement in person. So with the help of veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and everyday citizens who refused to let his story be ignored, Elijah planned something big. A massive rally in Washington, D.C., not just a march, not just a protest, a defining moment. A rally where veterans, activists, and lawmakers would stand together and demand accountability, not just from one airline, but from an entire industry that had overlooked discrimination and mistreatment for far too long. The night before the rally, Elijah sat alone in his hotel room in Washington, staring out at the city skyline. His phone was buzzing nonstop. Messages from journalists requesting interviews, veterans promising their attendance, supporters sending encouragement. And yet, despite all of this, Elijah felt a wave of doubt creeping in. What if no one showed up? What if the airline ignored them, just like before? What if this fight was too big for him? He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to silence the fear. Then a message popped up on his screen. From Sergeant Marcus Reynolds. Elijah, I just wanted to say thank you. I was dishonorably discharged after an injury because my CO saw me as weak. It took me years to fight for my benefits to get my dignity back. You're fighting for all of us. You're making them see us. I'll be there tomorrow. So will hundreds of others. Keep going, brother. We've got your back. Elijah stared at the words, his eyes burning. This wasn't about him. This was about thousands of people just like him. People who had fought, served, and sacrificed only to be treated like they didn't belong. He wiped his face, exhaled, and stood taller than ever. Tomorrow was going to be historic. Elijah arrived at the National Mall early, his heart pounding. As he stepped out of the car, he was met with a sight he would never forget. A sea of people, thousands of veterans, their uniforms crisp, standing side by side. Families holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans," and "No more discrimination." Activists, politicians, and everyday Americans who had come to say enough is enough. Elijah felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a protest. This was history the national news crews had already set up. Journalists were broadcasting live, and the world was watching. A reporter approached Elijah. "Mr. Carter, did you ever imagine that this fight would lead you here, to one of the biggest rallies for veterans' rights in decades?" Elijah swallowed hard, glancing at the massive crowd before him. "No," he admitted, "but now that we're here, we're not stopping." The cheers from the crowd erupted behind him. Elijah stood at the podium, gripping the microphone as thousands waited in silence. He could feel the weight of every veteran, every person who had been dismissed, every individual who had ever been treated like they were less than. He took a deep breath. "I didn't ask to be here," he began, his voice strong. "I was just a man trying to get home from a flight. But what happened to me, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was part of a system that tells veterans that their service means nothing the moment they take off their uniform." The crowd murmured in agreement. "I've heard the stories from so many of you. The veteran who was kicked off a flight because the airline didn't believe his ID was real. The Marine who was questioned for sitting in first class because he didn't look like he belonged there. The Army officer who was humiliated in front of his family just because of the color of his skin." His voice cracked with emotion. "Enough is enough." The crowd erupted. "We are done accepting apologies with no action. We are done being ignored. Today we are here to say to every airline, every corporation, every institution that disrespects veterans, that treats us as invisible, we see you, and we will not stop until you see us." A roar of applause. Elijah wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for all of them. That night, the airline issued a new statement. They publicly admitted fault. They announced new veteran policies, including priority boarding and stronger anti-discrimination training. They committed to an external oversight board to ensure no veteran would be mistreated again. But it wasn't enough. The pressure had only just begun. And Elijah? He was just getting started. Elijah Carter had spent months pushing for change. He had walked into this battle alone, just a man humiliated on a flight, stripped of his dignity, and told, without words, that he didn't belong. But now he wasn't alone. He had an entire movement behind him. Veterans, activists, politicians, families, millions of people who believed in the fight for justice. And finally, after months of relentless pressure, the airline had no choice but to act. The change Elijah fought for was happening. But at what key? Elijah sat in his apartment, his hands clenched, as he watched the CEO of the airline step up to the podium on live television. For months, they had ignored him. For months, they had hoped he would go away. For months, they had resisted change. But today, they were surrendering to the movement. "We acknowledge that we have failed," the CEO began, his voice heavy. "We acknowledge that the incident involving Mr. Carter was not an isolated event, but rather a symptom of a much larger problem." Elijah's breath caught. They weren't just apologizing. They were admitting the truth, the thing corporations never say out loud. "We have taken a hard look at our policies, and we are making real changes, not just for Mr. Carter, but for every passenger who has ever been disrespected, and more importantly, for every veteran who has been denied the dignity they deserve." Then came the real announcement. an independent oversight board to monitor discrimination cases within the airline, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, including flight attendants and supervisors, veteran priority policies, ensuring service members were treated with the highest level of respect, public transparency, requiring the airline to report on its progress every quarter. Elijah's hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just a corporate statement. This was policy change. This was proof that one man could make a difference. Elijah had spent so many months fighting, pushing, demanding justice. But the moment the CEO finished speaking, he didn't feel relief. He felt the weight of it all finally crash down on him. Because this wasn't just a win. This was a reminder of everything it had cost him. His peace, his sanity, the nights he spent awake wondering if he was wasting his time. Elijah put his head in his hands. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to break. The emotions he had buried, the anger, the humiliation, the exhaustion, all came flooding back at once. Because this fight should have never had to happen. It shouldn't have taken millions of voices to make them listen. It shouldn't have taken a man being humiliated and dragged off a plane for an airline to realize that respect should never be conditional. But Elijah knew one thing: change doesn't come easy. And while the airline had announced reforms, he wasn't done yet, because words were just words. And now it was time to make sure they followed through. The pressure didn't stop with one airline. As news of the reforms spread, other industries started to take notice. Major hotel chains announced that they were reviewing how they treated military veterans. Another airline preemptively changed its policies, fearing backlash. Even ride-sharing companies pledged to work with veterans organizations to ensure fair treatment. Elijah's fight had sparked something bigger. What had started as one incident on a flight had become a reckoning for corporations everywhere. They had finally been forced to ask themselves, are we treating people fairly? Are we upholding our values? What happens if we don't change? The fear of becoming the next PR disaster pushed them to act. And that was power. Elijah knew better than to trust corporations to do the right thing on their own, because he had seen what they were capable of. The fake apologies, the empty promises, the "will do better" statements that meant nothing behind closed doors. So he made a decision. He wasn't just going to celebrate the victory, he was going to hold them accountable. That's why he needs you. Elijah Carter never expected to become the face of a movement. At first, he was just a man who wanted to get home. He had boarded that plane expecting a simple flight, but in a matter of minutes, his dignity had been stripped away. He had been told to move, not because he had done anything wrong, but because someone assumed he didn't belong. At that moment, Elijah could have walked away. He could have let it go. He could have moved on. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who had ever been disrespected. It was about every person of color who had been treated unfairly. It was about every passenger who had been dismissed, silenced, and ignored. So Elijah fought back. And what started as one man's battle for justice became a movement that shook an entire industry. A full year after the incident, Elijah sat at a coffee shop in Washington, D.C., watching the world move around him. So much had changed since that flight. The airline had been forced to implement real reforms. Veterans were given priority treatment in air travel. Racial discrimination training became mandatory in multiple industries. Airlines were now being held accountable in ways they never had been before. And yet, for Elijah, the biggest victory wasn't the policies. It was the people. The ones who had messaged him, telling him his fight gave them the courage to speak up. The veterans who no longer felt invisible when they traveled. The everyday passengers who refused to accept mistreatment anymore. Elijah had become a symbol, not of anger, but of resilience, of change, of what happens when one person refuses to be silent. Elijah was stirring his coffee when his phone buzzed. An email. From the airline CEO. Subject, let's talk. His heart skipped a beat. For months, he had been monitoring their progress, holding them accountable. And now they were reaching out to him. Elijah, we'd like to invite you to speak at our annual corporate summit. We know we've come a long way, but we also know we still have work to do. Your voice has been critical in pushing us toward real change, and we believe the best way to continue this progress is to keep the conversation going. Plus, Elijah leaned back, smiling to himself, not because he had won, but because they had finally learned. This fight was never just about punishing one airline. It was about forcing a system to evolve. And now, they were listening. A month later, Elijah stood on a massive stage at the airline's corporate summit. The very same company that had once dismissed him was now giving him the microphone. He took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of executives, employees, and industry leaders. A year ago, I was humiliated on one of your flights. I was treated like I didn't belong, like I wasn't worthy of respect, like my service to this country meant nothing. The room was silent. But today, I stand here, not as a victim, but as a reminder. A reminder that the world is changing. A reminder that when people speak up, corporations have no choice but to listen. And most importantly, a reminder that the true test of leadership isn't what you say when things are easy, but what you do when you're forced to confront your failures. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded in agreement. Elijah let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said the words that no one in that room would ever forget. I didn't start this fight for revenge. I started it because I believe in better. Better treatment for veterans. Better accountability in corporations. Better respect for all people, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what seat they're sitting in. The only question now is, are you ready to continue that change? The audience erupted in applause, not because it was just a great speech, but because they knew he was right. Elijah's story isn't just his own. It's a story about all of us, about the moments where we're told to be quiet, about the times we're expected to just accept mistreatment, about the choices we make when we can either walk away or stand our ground. Elijah made his choice. Now it's your turn. Like this post if you believe in standing up for what's right. Comment, I stand with Elijah to show your support. Share this story because the more people who hear it, the harder it is for corporations to ignore. Subscribe to stay updated because this isn't just one man's fight, it's a movement. Real change happens when we refuse to be silent.